Hello, everyone, and welcome back to History Whispers, the podcast where we explore the deepest minds and timeless legacies of history's greatest philosophers. I'm your host, Emma Carter, and you're listening to the Philosopher Series. Today, we turn our attention to a name that echoes through every philosophy classroom, every political theory debate, and every discussion about truth, virtue, and the examined life: Socrates. And with me once again is the ever-brilliant Dr. Rhys Morgana, historian, philosopher, and returning guest here at History Whispers. Dr. Rhys, welcome back.
Thank you, Emma. It's always a pleasure.
Let's begin by painting a picture of the world Socrates was born into. What was the intellectual and political climate of Athens at that time? What kind of environment shaped him?
That's a beautiful place to start, Emma. Because to understand Socrates, we have to understand the world that formed him, and, in many ways, the world he later challenged. Socrates was born around 470 BCE, in a period that's often called the Golden Age of Athens. But it wasn't golden in every way. Politically, Athens was experimenting with democracy, something new, fragile, and incredibly radical for its time. The idea that ordinary citizens could vote, speak freely, and influence decisions was still evolving. Culturally, it was a time of incredible artistic and intellectual energy. You had the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides on the stage, the architecture of the Parthenon rising into the sky, and thinkers like Anaxagoras, Pythagoras, and later Democritus beginning to question the nature of reality itself. But beneath that brilliance, Athens was also deeply insecure. The Persian Wars had shaken the city, and though they emerged victorious, the memory of destruction and vulnerability lingered. Then came the Peloponnesian War, a devastating, decades-long conflict with Sparta that left Athens politically unstable, economically drained, and spiritually wounded. So, imagine a young man, barefoot, poor, rough in appearance, walking through this dazzling yet deeply anxious city, questioning everyone from generals to poets to politicians. That was Socrates. He wasn't a product of peace and comfort. He was shaped by tension, by war, by philosophical curiosity, and by a society that outwardly praised freedom of thought, but inwardly feared its consequences. And the result? He became the mirror Athens didn't want to look into. He held up questions that exposed pride, hypocrisy, and illusion, not because he hated Athens, but because he loved it enough to tell it the truth. That tension between brilliance and blindness, freedom and fear, that is the Athens Socrates was born into. And it explains both why he mattered so much and why they couldn't tolerate him in the end.
Dr. Rhys, kindly explain the core philosophy of Socrates for us. What are the main notions that we know about, and what do they really mean in human terms?
Absolutely, Emma. This is where Socrates truly becomes unforgettable, not just as a historical figure, but as a living voice for the soul. You see, Socrates didn't write books or lay out a formal system of thought. What we have are fragments, pieces of conversations preserved by Plato and others. But those fragments carry some of the most profound notions we've ever encountered in philosophy. Let me break them down into three central pillars. First, Socrates believed that virtue is knowledge. That sounds simple, but it's revolutionary. He argued that if someone truly understands what is good, they will naturally do it. To him, no one willingly chooses evil. They do so out of ignorance. That's a powerful and deeply compassionate view of human behavior. He didn't see people as evil. He saw them as lost or unaware. It's a philosophy that urges us to educate, not punish, to illuminate, not condemn. Second is the famous Socratic Method, the art of asking questions, but not just any questions. Socrates would walk into the marketplace, find someone who thought they had the answer about justice, courage, love, and through calm, persistent inquiry, he would gently unravel their assumptions. He didn't do it to win. He did it to wake them up. When you read those dialogues and see someone slowly realize they've never really thought deeply about their beliefs, it's moving. There's a kind of quiet transformation happening. And that method, it's a gift. one we still use today in classrooms, therapy, journalism, anywhere truth is being pursued. Third, and maybe the most haunting, is Socrates' belief that the soul is more important than the body. He lived that belief. He was poor, he walked barefoot, he ate little, but he fiercely protected his integrity. He believed our true self, our soul, needed care, just like our body does.
That's incredibly insightful, Dr. Rhys. Thank you for painting that picture so vividly. Now, something you mentioned in our previous episode about Heraclitus really stuck with me. You explained how his philosophy was deeply influenced by the circumstances of his time, his environment, his isolation, his disillusionment with society. Would you say the same holds true for Socrates? Was his thinking, his method, his mission also shaped by the turbulent world around him? And on a lighter note, we learned that Heraclitus was sometimes called the obscure or even the weeping philosopher. Does Socrates have any such nicknames or lesser-known titles passed down through history? Anything symbolic that reflects how later generations perceived him?
That's a wonderful connection, Emma. And yes, I absolutely believe that. Just like Heraclitus, Socrates was profoundly shaped by his world. But in Socrates' case, the influence wasn't isolation, it was confrontation. Where Heraclitus withdrew from society, Socrates leaned directly into it. He walked the busiest streets of Athens during its rise and fall, spoke with politicians, soldiers, craftsmen, and poets. He sought people out. He believed philosophy didn't belong in ivory towers or dusty temples. It belonged in the marketplace, in conversation, in the daily choices of ordinary life. The constant political turmoil around him, especially the Peloponnesian War, only sharpened his sense of urgency. He saw how ambition without wisdom could destroy cities. He saw how democracy could be manipulated. He saw how people claimed to know truth, but acted from ego, fear, and ignorance. And so he made it his mission to ask the hardest questions, not just to others, but to himself. Because to Socrates, philosophy wasn't just shaped by life, it was a way to survive it, to rise above it. Now, about the nicknames, that's such a fascinating point. Socrates wasn't called the obscure like Heraclitus, but he did earn some very symbolic descriptions over time. Plato often compared him to a gadfly, a small, annoying insect that constantly stings a lazy horse to keep it awake. That's how Socrates saw himself in Athens, a necessary irritation to wake the city up from moral and intellectual complacency. Others refer to him as a midwife of ideas. He didn't claim to give birth to wisdom. He helped others deliver it from within themselves through questioning. That metaphor is beautiful and strange, and Socrates embraced it. He believed his job was to help people give birth to truth, not force-feed them answers. And while he may not have been given a poetic title like the weeping philosopher, history remembers him through something much more powerful, his method and his death. Because while others faded into legend or mystery, Socrates stayed human. He questioned, he irritated, he loved wisdom more than life itself. And in doing so, he became immortal in the most meaningful way possible, through ideas that continue to challenge and change.
Wow, a gadfly. That's such a powerful and surprisingly fitting image. Now, you mentioned earlier one of his most famous students, Plato, whose own legacy is monumental. But of course, Socrates didn't only shape Plato. I'd love to talk more about the circle of minds he inspired. Who were Socrates' students, and how did they carry his philosophy forward after his death?
That's a great question, Emma, and it really takes us into the heart of Socrates' true legacy, not in writings or monuments, but in minds shaped and questions ignited. Let's start with the obvious name, Plato. Without Plato, we probably wouldn't know Socrates at all. After Socrates' death, Plato was devastated. He left Athens, traveled, reflected, and then eventually began writing what we now call the Socratic dialogues. In those works, Plato doesn't just preserve Socrates' ideas, he elevates him into almost a mythic figure. Through dialogues like the Apology, Phaedo, and Republic, Plato gave us a Socrates who is wise, ironic, deeply principled, and who uses reason like a scalpel. But what's interesting is that Plato didn't just repeat Socrates, he evolved him. While Socrates focused on ethics and virtue through questioning, Plato introduced metaphysics, the world of forms, the nature of the soul, the ideal state. So you can see Socrates as the spark and Plato as the fire it became. Another key student was Xenophon, a soldier and historian. His Socrates is less abstract, more practical and moralistic. In his writings, Socrates is like a mentor-uncle figure, full of sound advice and ethical strength. It's not as philosophically rich as Plato, but it gives us another angle, a more down-to-earth Socrates. Then there's Antisthenes, often considered the father of cynicism. He took Socrates' idea of virtue and radicalized it, embracing poverty, rejecting societal norms, and seeking virtue through a kind of rugged independence. You can almost see in Antisthenes the early seed of what would later become Stoicism. And finally, Alcibiades, not a philosopher, but a charismatic general and politician who was deeply influenced by Socrates. Their relationship was complex. Socrates tried to instill virtue in him, but Alcibiades chose ambition, fame, and war. That contrast shows us something poignant, that even Socrates couldn't always reach the hearts he hoped to change. So yes, Emma, Socrates lived on in his students. Not all followed his exact path. Some turned left when he would have turned right. But the mark he left on them was indelible. Through Plato's pen, through Xenophon's stories, through Antisthenes' radical ethics, Socrates never truly left the world. His classroom wasn't a building, it was a way of seeing. And his students, knowingly or not, carried that vision into the future.
Well, Dr. Rhys, I can already tell we're going to need a separate episode just to explore the philosophies of Plato, Antisthenes, and the rest of Socrates' intellectual legacy. But for today, let's stay rooted in the man himself. There's a particular quote from Socrates that I think confuses and fascinates people more than any other. He famously said, "I know that I know nothing." How could someone so deeply wise, someone who shaped the entire foundation of Western thought, make such a statement? What did he really mean by that?
That's such a powerful question, Emma, and it really does sit at the heart of everything Socrates stood for. Now, first, it's important to clarify that the phrase, "I know that I know nothing," isn't a direct quote from Socrates himself, since, as we've said, he never wrote anything down. The closest version comes from Plato's Apology, where Socrates recounts the story of how the oracle at Delphi proclaimed that no one is wiser than Socrates. Naturally, Socrates was puzzled by this. He didn't feel wise. So he began questioning politicians, poets, craftsmen, people who were reputed to be wise. And what he found was they all thought they knew things, but couldn't explain them. Socrates, by contrast, was aware of his own ignorance. And that's where the famous quote emerges, not as a boast of false humility, but as a radical kind of wisdom. It's Plato who phrases this clearest in the Apology, where Socrates says, "I am wiser than this man. It is likely that neither of us knows anything worthwhile, but he thinks he knows something when he does not, whereas when I do not know, neither do I think I know. So I am likely to be wiser than he to this small extent, that I do not think I know what I do not know." So what Socrates is really saying is, true wisdom begins with intellectual humility. He wasn't claiming to know nothing, he was acknowledging the limits of human knowledge. And in doing so, he distinguished himself from the arrogance of those who pretended to certainty. It's a lesson that remains urgently relevant today. In politics, media, education, even our personal relationships. This principle, the awareness of ignorance, becomes the foundation for the Socratic method, asking, testing, probing assumptions. And it's been echoed by thinkers from Descartes to Karl Popper, who cited Socratic doubt as the birthplace of critical reasoning. You can find excellent commentary on this in Gregory Vlastos's book, Socrates, Ironist and Moral Philosopher, where he argues that Socrates didn't deny all knowledge. Rather, he aimed to draw a line between pretended knowledge and earned understanding. In a way, Emma, that quote is Socrates' quiet revolution, Because while others were shouting, declaring, and preaching, he was asking humbly. And somehow, in that humility, he shook the foundations of Western thought.
That's such a beautiful insight, Dr. Rhys, that true wisdom begins with humility, and that for someone like Socrates, knowledge wasn't a destination, it was a lifelong journey. The way he embraced unknowing, it almost feels sacred. But now we come to what is, for many, the most heartbreaking part of his story, the end. This man who spent his life seeking truth, uplifting dialogue, and challenging minds with respect, was ultimately persecuted by the very society he tried to serve. Dr. Rhys, help us understand this. Why did Athens, a city that prided itself on freedom and intellect, turn against Socrates? What led to his trial and execution? And what does it tell us about both him and the world he lived in?
Emma, this is where the story of Socrates becomes not just philosophical, but profoundly human. His death still stings, not because it was unexpected, but because it was so unjust, and yet he accepted it with such incredible composure. Let's go back to the setting, Athens in 399 BCE. The city was still reeling from its defeat in the Peloponnesian War. There was political instability, a kind of national humiliation. The democracy had been briefly overthrown by an oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants, some of whom, by the way, had ties to Socrates' former students. So tensions were high. The atmosphere was paranoid, wounded, desperate to find order and identity again. And here was Socrates, in the public square, still asking uncomfortable questions, still challenging the assumptions of politicians, poets, and the elite. He wasn't a rebel with a sword. He was far more dangerous, a rebel with a question. And that, Emma, is what made him intolerable to the establishment. He was charged with two things: impiety, not believing in the gods of the city, and corrupting the youth. But those were just the surface charges. The deeper issue was that Socrates refused to conform, and more than that, he forced others to confront their own ignorance. Imagine being a powerful Athenian, respected, educated, and this barefoot philosopher publicly exposes that you don't actually understand the things you claim to know. That's not just embarrassing, that's threatening. There's a tragic irony here. Athens, the cradle of democracy, turned on one of its most democratic voices, a man who never stopped engaging, never stopped believing in dialogue. And yet they voted, by a narrow margin, to execute him. Now here's what truly set Socrates apart. He could have escaped. His followers offered to smuggle him out, but he refused. Why? Because he believed in the rule of law, even when that law turned against him. He said in Plato's Crito that if he fled, he would undermine everything he had ever taught about justice, citizenship, and integrity. Emma, that decision is one of the most powerful moral stands in history. Socrates didn't just talk about virtue, he died for it. And in that moment, when he took the cup of hemlock with serenity, surrounded by his students, he became more than a teacher. He became a symbol of what it means to live and die with conviction.
Dr. Rhys, is it true that Socrates was actually given multiple options at his trial, perhaps to leave the city or suggest a lesser punishment? And if that's the case, why did he choose death? Why not take the chance to live?
Yes, Emma, it's true. During his trial, under Athenian law, Socrates was allowed to propose an alternative punishment after being found guilty. He could have suggested exile, he could have paid a fine, and his friends even offered to pay it for him. He could have, quite realistically, walked away with his life. But instead, he offered something that shocked the court. He suggested that instead of punishment, he should be rewarded, given free meals at the Prytaneum, the place where Olympic champions and honored citizens were fed by the state. Now, of course, he said this partly with irony, but also with conviction, because in his heart, Socrates didn't believe he had done anything wrong. He wasn't going to beg for mercy or pretend guilt just to save his own life. That would violate everything he stood for. In Plato's Apology, he makes it heartbreakingly clear. He says, The difficulty, my friends, is not in avoiding death, but in avoiding unrighteousness, for that runs faster than death. He wasn't afraid of dying, he was afraid of betraying his own principles. And that, Emma, is what makes this choice so profound. Socrates believed that it was better to die justly than to live by compromising truth. To him, life wasn't about survival, it was about integrity. Living without virtue, without honesty, without philosophy, wasn't life at all. There's also something deeper here. By accepting death in such a public, deliberate way, Socrates was giving one final lesson, that courage, truth, and moral clarity aren't just ideas you talk about in the agora. They're things you live, even to the end. In that moment, Emma, Socrates became immortal. Not through escaping death, but by choosing it on his own terms. And it's why we're still talking about him 2,000 years later.
It gives me chills. And that moment when he drinks the hemlock, surrounded by his students, it's just so profoundly moving, Dr. Rhys, a testament to his unwavering commitment to his principles, even in the face of death.
Indeed, Emma, one of the most heartbreaking and beautiful scenes ever written. He talks calmly about the soul, about immortality, about the philosopher's task of preparing for death. And then he drinks the poison with serenity. No anger, no fear, just principle.
Could you tell us, Dr. Rhys, what were Socrates' final recorded words? And perhaps more importantly, what meaning or significance we can draw from them?
Ah, yes, his very last words, as immortalized by Plato. His final utterance, addressed to his devoted student and friend Crito, was, "Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Please pay it and do not neglect it." Its profound significance lies beneath its surface simplicity, requiring us to delve into the historical, religious, and philosophical context of ancient Athens. Let's break it down. Asclepius, for our listeners, was the Greek god of medicine and healing. It was a well-established custom to offer a rooster as a sacrifice of gratitude to Asclepius upon recovery from a grave illness or injury. Now, the crucial point here, of course, is that Socrates was not recovering from an illness. He was, quite deliberately, succumbing to a fatal dose of hemlock, willingly embracing death. This stark contrast immediately compels us to consider the deeper metaphorical meaning. The most widely accepted and intellectually compelling interpretation, rooted firmly in the argument Socrates has just meticulously laid out in the book, is that he regarded death as the ultimate healing, a liberation from the disease or impediment of bodily existence. Socrates argues that the philosopher's life is, in essence, a constant preparation for death. The soul, imprisoned within the body, is constantly battling its physical limitations. Death, therefore, is not an end to be feared, but rather the long-awaited moment of freedom, the release of the soul from its corporeal shackles. It is the cure that allows the soul to embark on its true journey towards unalterate knowledge and ultimate reality. From this perspective, the offering to Asclepius is a perfectly logical and deeply pious act of thanksgiving for this profound spiritual healing. As Professor David Sedley and others have extensively analyzed, this aligns seamlessly with the dialogue's central themes of the soul's immortality and the philosopher's detachment from bodily concerns.
Wonderful. Such wisdom, even at the time when a person is dying. Just fearless. Truly remarkable. So, Dr. Rhys, moving from his final moments to his enduring legacy, could you elaborate on how the philosophy of Socrates remains profoundly relevant in today's world? And perhaps more concretely, how are we observing the manifestation of his philosophy in the modern era across various aspects and walks of life?
That's a truly vital question, Emma. His philosophy, despite being articulated over 2 millennia ago, resonates with astonishing contemporary relevance, often manifesting in ways we might not immediately recognize. Firstly, let's address the enduring relevance of his Socratic Method, or Elenchus. In an age saturated with information, often uncritically consumed, Socrates' relentless questioning, his insistence on defining terms, and his pursuit of coherent, justified beliefs are more critical than ever. We see its direct descendants in various fields.
In education, the move towards active learning, critical thinking, and student-led inquiry rather than rote memorization is fundamentally Socratic. Think of problem-based learning in medical schools or the case study method in law schools. These are designed to force students to grapple with concepts, articulate their reasoning, and defend their positions, much like Socrates challenged his interlocutors on the streets of Athens. This pedagogical approach, emphasizing dialogue and critical analysis over passive reception, has been extensively discussed by educational theorists like Paulo Freire, who, while perhaps not directly citing Socrates, championed a similar liberatory education.
So it's about not just knowing what to think, but how to think.
Precisely, and this extends beyond the classroom into public discourse. In an era of echo chambers, misinformation, and intellectual polarization, Socrates' demand for clarity, consistency, and rational argumentation provides a powerful antidote. His method compels us to examine the underlying assumptions of political rhetoric, social media narratives, and even our own deeply held convictions. When we demand evidence, seek logical consistency, or ask for definitions of terms like freedom or justice, we are, in essence, employing a Socratic lens. It's a call to intellectual rigor in a world often content with superficiality.
Truly amazing. Dr. Rhys, as we approach the end of this insightful podcast, one final question for you. What is the most vital lesson our young generation, especially, should take away from the philosophy of Socrates, particularly in navigating today's complex world? And to conclude, would you mind sharing your personal favorite quotation from Socrates and perhaps tell us briefly why it resonates so deeply with you?
That's a perfect question to wrap up our discussion, Emma, because while Socrates' ideas are timeless, their application to the challenges faced by today's young generation is particularly poignant. If I had to distill one vital lesson for the young generation from Socrates' philosophy, it would be this: embrace intellectual humility and cultivate critical self-reflection. In an age of unprecedented connectivity and information overload, a paradoxically challenging environment for genuine understanding, there's a powerful temptation to equate knowing more with knowing better. Social media, for instance, often rewards quick, confident declarations rather than thoughtful, nuanced inquiry. Socrates, however, famously declared, "I know that I know nothing." This wasn't a statement of ignorance, but of profound epistemological insight. It was an admission of the limits of human knowledge, a recognition that true wisdom begins with acknowledging how much we don't know. For young people today, this translates into several key practices. Firstly, question everything, including your own assumptions and biases. Don't passively accept information, whether from news feeds, peers, or authority figures. Ask why. Ask, how do we know this? Seek out diverse perspectives, not just those that confirm what you already believe. This is the essence of the Socratic method applied to personal knowledge acquisition. As Martha Nussbaum, a prominent contemporary philosopher, has often argued in her work on education, cultivating this type of Socratic self-examination is crucial for democratic citizenship and personal autonomy. Secondly, prioritize reasoned dialogue over confident assertion. Socrates engaged in conversations, not debates aimed at winning. He sought to clarify, to understand, and to arrive at a more robust truth collaboratively. In our increasingly polarized world, learning to listen empathetically, to construct coherent arguments, and to engage respectfully with opposing viewpoints, even if you disagree fundamentally, is an invaluable Socratic skill. It fosters intellectual growth and civic engagement, moving beyond superficial disagreements to address underlying principles. And thirdly, cultivate self-knowledge as the foundation of ethical living. Socrates believed that virtue is inextricably linked to understanding oneself. For young people navigating complex ethical landscapes, from personal relationships to digital citizenship, understanding their own values, motivations, and potential blind spots is crucial. Before judging others or acting impulsively, pausing to reflect on why one believes what one believes or why one feels compelled to act in a certain way is a fundamentally Socratic exercise. It's about building an inner compass based on reasoned principles rather than fleeting opinions or external pressures.
That's incredibly powerful advice, Dr. Rhys. Intellectual humility and critical self-reflection.
Exactly. It's about empowering oneself to think deeply rather than just react. And yes, as for my personal favorite quotation from Socrates, it's a difficult choice, as so many of his words resonate. But if I had to pick one, it would be, "The only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing." It resonates so deeply with me because it is, paradoxically, the most profound statement of wisdom. It's not an embrace of ignorance, but an embrace of intellectual honesty and the precondition for all genuine learning. It strips away arrogance and intellectual complacency, forcing us to remain perpetually open to inquiry, to challenge, and to growth. In a world that often rewards certainty, Socrates reminds us that true wisdom lies in a humble and unending pursuit of understanding, always acknowledging the vastness of what remains unknown. For a philosopher, there is no truer or more liberating starting point.
Dr. Rhys, that is a truly fitting and inspiring note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us again on the Socrates Today. Your insights are always so incredibly enriching.
My absolute pleasure, Emma. Thank you for having me.
And that brings us to the end of Episode 3 of The Greatest Philosophers of All Time. What an incredible journey we've had today, delving deep into the wisdom and enduring legacy of Socrates. For those of you who might have missed them, our first 2 episodes in this series are available in our playlist, and we'd love to hear from you. Please leave us a comment or review and tell us which philosopher you'd like us to explore in an upcoming episode. Your input truly helps shape our discussions. Until next time, keep listening to History Whispers, because as we always say, history always whispers.